Well, hello and welcome back to the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint podcast series. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, and we're excited to have you here today. Gosh, it's midsummer already. It's July 17th, 2025, and we've got another great show in store for you today. We've got Tamara Ward here to talk to us about some really interesting data and research that she was doing. And Tamara will be joining us here in just a moment. But before we do, those of you that might not be familiar with who we are and what we do, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was formed a little over 6 years ago. We are a small nonprofit really focused on, well, if you look at our mission statement, it's about reducing and eliminating punitive exclusionary discipline, a lot of outdated behavioral management approaches, ending the school to prison pipeline. It's about making a difference. And our work, of course, started around the issue of restraint and seclusion, but it's really much broader than that. It's restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. It's all the things that can lead down that school to prison pipeline as well. And we're really on a mission to try to help influence some positive change here. So excited to have you here today. And if you happen to be watching live already, one of the... Oops, I just noticed we have a slight problem here, and I'm going to try to fix it real quick. All right. For some reason, our live stream is not working on Facebook, it looks like. So let me see if I can figure that out real quick. I just see it looks like the stream was deleted on Facebook. And we're going to see if we can fix that. But if not, we will flow with things and then try to fix it. Sometimes there's issues behind the scenes. Courtney, if you could take a look at that. Courtney, of course, is behind the scenes trying to help out here. But we are live on a number of channels here, and we're going to see if we can figure out what is going on there with our Facebook feed if you're not able to get that. But if you happen to be watching live now, let us know. Let us know in the comments who you are and where you're from. It's always fun to see where people happen to be joining us from, and always excited to have people joining us really from all over the world so many times. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up our guest here, and hopefully we'll figure out why Facebook seems to not be working right now. And hopefully we'll get that figured out. If not, we'll roll with it and continue on. So let me go ahead and bring up our guest here, Tamara Ward. Tamara, I'm really excited to have you here today. So thank you for joining me for the podcast. You and I had a chance to connect some time ago. And in fact, I don't remember how long ago it was initially, but had a bit of a conversation. You were doing some really interesting research. And I'm going to actually share your bio here and talk about kind of who you are and what you've done. And then I know you've got some interesting data and a story to share with us. You are a 2023 National Association of Black Journalists Pew Youth Justice Fellow, also a MDDC Press Association award-winning multi-platinum journalist, multi-platform, let me get that right there. And you are an accomplished communications professional with over 20 years of experience in various communication disciplines, including journalism, media relations, crisis communications, marketing, social media, and web. However, journalism is really your first love, and you have a lot of experience covering environments, covering the environment, sports, government, politics, and community news for a variety of platforms, including print, online, and broadcast. The very first interview that you conducted was with Rosa Parks. That's really something. Decades later, Tamara reported for E&E News on Capitol Hill about environmental and energy policy and politics, and where they intersect with the Trump administration, the 2020 presidential campaign, the House impeachment inquiry, and the State of the Union address, and COVID-19. In 2024, you completed a fellowship with NABJ and the Pew Research Center. Previously, you've covered the Maryland General Assembly, county government, and local and state politics for APG Media. Your articles have appeared in half a dozen newspapers in Maryland, including the Calvert Recorder, which is my area here. I'm in Calvert County, the Maryland Independent, and the Enterprise. A Brookings Legis Fellow in the House of Representatives. You managed gun violence prevention, veterans issues, voter rights, and more. Currently, you work in a robust press office in the federal government, and you're a two-time graduate of the University of Maryland College Park, where you earned a bachelor's in speech communications, and as a Eleanor Merrill Fellow, and you've obtained a master's in broadcast journalism. So you've got a tremendous amount of background in this area. And you and I connected because you were doing some research really very related to the work that we do here at the Alliance. Of course, as I mentioned in the intro, we are very focused on a lot of the punitive and exclusionary discipline. It's, of course, things like restraint and seclusion, but it's suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. It's a school to prison pipeline. And you've written a series of articles, and we're going to be sharing links to that series of articles throughout as well, talking about this. But you've taken a really deep dive into some really critical issues around, punitive discipline that highly relate to kind of the school to prison pipeline, and where law enforcement gets involved, and a lot of interesting things that very much intersect with the work we do here at the Alliance. So I thought it would be really a fantastic opportunity to have you on and talk about your research. And of course, your research is over a certain area, but what we also know is that a lot of these things that you're probably going to be talking about today are things that we see in many areas across the country, and many of these things are pretty well documented trends. So I'm excited to have you here and talking about your research. And we had talked about you've got a couple of slides you want to share to kind of walk us through this. But our hope today is to have somewhat of a conversation around all of this as well, and an opportunity. And it looks like maybe Courtney magically fixed things behind the scenes, but it looks like our technical issue hopefully has been corrected here as well. And if all has gone well, Facebook should be back, and people are able hopefully now to see us on all three platforms. So Tamara, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for, I'm going to thank you ahead of time from what I already know, but for all of the important work that you've done on many levels. And of course, I'm very interested in the work that you've done that's related to this, but you've been covering, people and topics and important things in your career, and just amazing. I mean, again, reading your intro, it's like, wow, Rosa Parks. I mean, that's just amazing.
Yes. And now I feel very, very old, but thank you so much. I appreciate being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my work.
Absolutely. And I think it's important work to share, because I think there's an opportunity to have some impact when people really understand and can advocate for changes and understand what the problem is. So I'm gonna pull up your slides here in just a moment. And before I do that, I just want to remind everyone, if you are watching live, and we hope you are, if you're watching live, feel free in the chat to let us know who you are and where you're from. It's always a lot of fun to see where people are joining us from. We find sometimes, this is really interesting, Tamara, although we're located in Maryland, not far from you, we have people from all over the country and often all over the world that join us for these conversations. And, a lot of things that we see that are happening in one place are happening in another place. So it's always a lot of fun to see. So if you're watching live, let us know in the chat who you are and where you're from. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring up to the stage your slide deck here. Sure. From homeroom to handcuffs. So our audience now can see your slide deck. And if you want to just kind of begin the conversation, begin kind of working us through the research that you've done, the stories that you've done. And I'm even interested in kind of, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but kind of the why behind it as well. Like what led you down the road of doing some of this research. So I'm going to kind of hand it off to you. But as we talked about, I'm going to stick around, and I might pop in with a question or a thought, or if we have questions that show up in our chat, I might bring those up as well. So if that all sounds good to you, I'll let you kind of begin taking it away.
Sure, that's great. Just wanted to share, first and foremost, the reason why I went down the path that I'm getting ready to discuss with you. I was fortunate enough to be selected to be part of a fellowship that the National Association of Black Journalists and Pew Research Center were putting together. I was one of 5 journalists selected, and our official title when we were selected were NABJ Pew Juvenile Justice Fellows. Sometime over the 10-month period of the fellowship, there was a decision made to change our title from juvenile justice to youth justice. And a lot of people use those two terms interchangeably, but there has been sort of this trend to move towards youth justice, sort of to reflect more so the emphasis on rehabilitation and youth development instead of just punishment. So I think that's important background information for people to know. Now, the reason why the fellowship was launched was because Pew and NABJ wanted to promote data-driven, responsible journalism and sort of correct some of the mischaracterizations that the media has had about youth or juveniles. And so I am not a courts and crime or a justice reporter. I come from a background of government and politics, environment and energy. And I thought this was a great opportunity to stretch myself, but also, show my range of abilities as a journalist. So with that, I am happy to go on and tell you exactly what it is that I covered. The focus of my fellowship was surrounded by and focused on primarily the school to prison pipeline. I initially wanted to focus on the myth that I had been hearing for years that the state of Maryland orders the number of prison beds based on the results of third grade reading scores. And I had pitched that to NABJ and Pew, and they were very much interested in the school to prison pipeline. But what I was finding was that, and I don't want to say myth, but that belief was very hard to substantiate. And I came across lots and lots of data and spoke to lots of people in law enforcement, youth advocacy, the judicial system. And what I was finding was this this large amount of data relative to school-based arrests. So to get to the crux of my story and my fellowship, I was looking at school-based arrests in all of Maryland's 24 school districts. And what I was noticing was a disproportionality in the number of arrests by demographic groups. And what I was finding was that Black students and students with disabilities were disproportionately arrested. Some of the research that I was able to come across was supported by data from state records. The Maryland State Department of Education, Department of Juvenile Services. And I was fortunate enough to come across individuals that were willing to share with me their personal testimonies as professionals, testimonies of their clients and cases they worked, as well as just a plethora of data from a gentleman, an education attorney by the name of Levi Bradford, and I apologize if I got his last name wrong, Bradford, at the Public Law Center. And so some of the data, some of the key findings that I had, are we ready to move into that? Did you have a question?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I appreciate you kind of sharing the why beneath this as well. The one thing I was going to ask you, just because this is kind of relevant, you were talking about the school to prison pipeline a bit in the lead up to this. And I wonder if you might, we have an audience here, many of whom probably have a good idea of what the school to prison pipeline is, but I wonder if you might, for those that might not be as familiar, give them a little bit of background on that. And then maybe we can kind of move into your data and findings.
Sure. And just, I guess, in short, the school to prison pipeline is terminology used to explain the situations in where students in the school system have a situation or a behavior or an incident that is referred to law enforcement, whether it be law enforcement embedded in the school, law enforcement in the community, or referral to the Department of Juvenile Services. And thereby, at this point, they are entered into um, the the justice system. They have a touch point in which they have now potentially a record. And so now, for some, the belief is that once you are in this pipeline, that it just perpetuates. And so part of my research sort of delves into that. I don't know if we'll be able to go to that in length. I actually have a infographic that I created that is not part of this deck that actually charts that entire process from the referral through the courts. Maybe if you have me back, I can be prepared for that one. But that's basically what the school to prison pipeline is.
Gotcha. Perfect. No, I appreciate that. And I think a lot of people that are part of our community have heard us talk about that. I mean, the data that we see, whether it's looking at restraint and seclusion or increase in suspension and expulsion, there's definitely a lot of correlation between, the children who are restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, and subjected to corporal punishment and entering into that juvenile justice and ultimately into the criminal justice system.
Yes.
So these are issues that we often talk about, but I appreciate you providing some background. So let me let you go ahead and if you want to take it on to your first slide and begin kind of talking through what your research findings were, and I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. So what I have up right now is an infographic that I was able to pull together from the research. And I think before we talk about the disparities in school-based arrests, it's very important to look at the numbers as a whole. And so what you will see on the screen is a chart of Maryland school-based arrests. You'll see all of the counties or the school districts listed out. And I actually looked at data going all the way back to the 2015-2016 school year through 2022-2023. However, I produced a 4-part series that primarily focuses on what was then the most recent school-based arrest data, and that was 2022-2023. Occasionally, through my story series, I will do some comparison of the data to prior years. But for primary purposes today, I am looking at 2022-2023, and I will note otherwise when it's different.
Gotcha.
So when you look at this particular chart, you'll see that in 2022-2023, the school-based arrest was at 1,568 school-based arrests across the board. The prior year, it was significantly more. So I think it's important to acknowledge the state and the school systems, that there was a 28% decrease in school-based arrests from the prior year. However, even though there is a reduction in school-based arrests, disparity still looms in the state. And so what you will see as I go through the slide decks, Black students accounted for 57% of all school-based arrests, but only represented 33% of the school population. That means roughly 3 Black students out of every 1,000 Black students in Maryland's school system was arrested. So that is the arrest rate for Black students. Students with disabilities made up 48% of arrests, yet they only represent 13% of the student enrollment. And that is significant. So when we look at students with disabilities, they have a higher arrest rate. Their arrest rate is 7 students per 1,000 students with disabilities are arrested.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first part of my story series, which is the overall title is From Homeroom to Handcuffs, but part one focuses on the data, specifically Black and disabled students, and them being disproportionately caught in the school to prison pipeline. What I did find out, many of the students are being arrested or referred for arrest, which they call a paper-based arrest, for low-level offenses. One of the low-level offenses is this charge on the books, and a lot of people call it ambiguous, is called disturbing schools activities.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2023, and pardon me as I look off because I've got data all over my three monitors. In 2023, 858 referrals were made to the Department of Juvenile Services for disturbing school activities.
And based on your research and reporting, again, I mean, you're right. That's pretty ambiguous. But were you able to connect with real stories about examples of what that meant?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I was, and it could be, being disruptive in class. It could be being at a on-campus activity or a school activity off campus, and being part of an incident or contributing to an incident on or off school property that some people feel does not rise to the level of criminal behavior.
Mm-hmm.
One example, and I lead off my story with this, is about an 11-year-old girl in Anne Arundel County. This is a story from 6 years ago, but it's an issue that has recently, I believe, got resolved or settled on in the courts. But 11-year-old girl was in class. She was not sitting in her assigned seat. She was asked to move to her seat, and she didn't. This was a young girl with disabilities. Her race doesn't matter, but for the record, and it's not disclosed in the article, she is white. She is an individual with disabilities. She has a documented IEP. It is acknowledged, it is noted in her records that sometimes when she is singled out or called on, she freezes and becomes unresponsive. And in this particular case, the teacher that is normally in the classroom was not there. What was reported to me was that the student was, that the person that was there was a substitute, that the substitute reported it to an administrator. And when the student did not continued not to respond and return to her seat, police were brought in. And the student, by the time the police got there, the student had complied, but she was taken by police from the school property, and she was arrested. And I don't want to give away too much because I want people to go read part one and hear the story and hear the story from the perspective as well as the attorney that was representing her. But I do have to disclose something. I am a parent of a special needs child. I have an adult daughter with developmental disabilities. And that particular story touched me because my daughter, indeed, when she is singled out, when she is asked about something that she may have not done correctly, she does freeze. And so just hearing that particular story and knowing that there's a chance that my child could possibly be in a situation
Yeah.
where someone is not familiar with her and how she responds and reacts, or the fact that she's processing, could arrest her,
Mhm.
is very scary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't tell you how often in the stories that I hear from families and parents and educators and others, how often, behind a child that's been restrained or secluded, or a child that's been suspended or expelled or had an interaction with law enforcement, how often really beneath the surface is a child who's not having their needs appropriately met. So here's a child that is not having their needs met, or having demands put on them that they are unable to meet. And I mean, unfortunately, and this is this is my belief, and you don't have to agree with me here, but unfortunately, I think that the focus that exists in schools on compliance often leads to an escalation of situations that should never have escalated in the first place. And not understanding a child's needs, or not understanding that a child is dysregulated, and continuing to put demands on them often escalates a situation that leads to that punitive exclusionary discipline, that leads to that interaction with law enforcement. And so many of these things should never have happened. I mean, we've seen cases, and I'm sure you've seen them as well, kind of nationally, of 6-year-olds put in handcuffs and taken out of classrooms for something that never should have gotten to that point. And I agree with you. I mean, it is, as a parent, that was something that would have been a concern of mine at one point. The possibility of something like that happening. It really is, frightening to know these things can happen. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact that, especially when we're looking at disabilities, or we're looking at kids that have had a great deal of trauma in their lives, many of the approaches that are being taken in the classrooms are not supporting the needs of these students. And we're seeing the escalations by well-intentioned, but sometimes not appropriately trained staff. And kids, I think about the many children that I've known that have ended up, kind of moving down one of these pathways. um, you know, Kids that need stability and need, certain, you know, a substitute teacher in a classroom, how often has that led to, a situation that's led to a disciplinary, impact? So anyway, I just wanted to share that thought that, very often there's so much more beneath the surface here. And, in many cases, it's a matter of children whose needs are not being appropriately met.
Yes. And it's interesting that you brought that up, because that was a reoccurring comment and theme in some of my interviews. I had the opportunity to talk to some public defenders that had represented kids that were arrested for disturbing school activities.
Mhm.
And that is a prime example that I gave you, just a student that was not sitting in her assigned seat and did not immediately respond and follow directions. I personally think that's something that could be considered benign and does not rise to the level of being arrested. But what we are finding with the disturbing school activities charge, and I know I shared this earlier, that 858 referrals were to the Department of Justice just in 2023. And in that same year, Anne Arundel County and Wacomico County led all the districts with charging students for disturbing school activities.
Mhm.
Arundel, I believe, had 225 charges, and Wacomico had 195.
Yeah.
Uh,
There's often, a case, and I'm sure that looking at the data as you have, that this is probably something you've seen as well. But, so often is the case, if you look at any of these things. So for instance, my journey began around the use of restraint and seclusion. Turns out that, we had an experience, in my family with my son being restrained and secluded. And it turns out that, we lived in Calvert County. Back in 2018, when this happened to him, data came out actually in that December about restraint seclusion for the first time at the state level. Turns out that Calvert County was number one in the state when it came to the use of seclusion. Number one, when you looked at it against enrollment, and that's something that's really important. Calvert County is a much smaller district than Montgomery or many other counties. But when you looked against enrollment, we were number one in the state in the use of seclusion, number two in the state in the use of restraint. Frederick County was very similar there. They were number one in restraint, number two in seclusion. Frederick eventually got investigated by the Department of Justice for their use of restraint seclusion. But the point that I was trying to get at is, very often what you find is if you look across any state, whether it be Maryland or Minnesota or California, you find pockets where these things are being done much more often. And, I always had the thought that, like, the kids in my county aren't that much different than the kids in the next county. There's nothing that changes, but the culture and the training within districts and schools can be significantly different from one to another. And that's where we see these spikes. One of the things I wanted to ask you about on this data, going back to that story I was just sharing, when you looked at this data, or I'm assuming you looked at this data at some point kind of in alignment with their enrollment to kind of figure out, okay, well, what when we look at St. Mary's or Calvert County or Wycomico County, even compared to a Prince George's or Montgomery, there's a big size differential there. What did you find in terms of, not just the raw numbers, but where were the highest areas of kind of these school-based arrests when you looked at it against the enrollment?
Yes. So when I looked at the data, there were definitely some school districts that were hot spots. The hot spots varied in terms of whether they were hot spots for students with disabilities or hot spots for students of color. I can tell you hot spots for students with disabilities was the Eastern Shore counties. And in my story, I covered that quite a bit. And I talked to advocates from Disability Rights Maryland who note the regional disparities and the lack of support for students with disabilities on the Eastern Shore. And so looking at the data that I have here, Wycomico, once again, county, 42% of students arrested in 22-23 school year 2022-2023 had disabilities.
Wow.
And so, that's alarming.
Right. Well, especially when you align it with what you found, and I made this, kind of the assertion that, this is often an indicator of a deeper problem, and the problem is we have children whose needs are not being appropriately met, which then leads to children that might be more likely to have, kind of distressed behavior and find themselves on the other end of a lot of punitive and, exclusionary. So there's a deeper problem. And the problem is not the children. The problem, is often kind of the approach that's being taken.
Definitely. I would agree. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight when we talk about numbers, looking at the numbers, the arrest rates for students with disabilities versus students overall. Overall, 2 students are likely to be arrested in terms of arrest rate. Overall school population, 2 students per 1,000 are likely to be arrested. But for students with disability, once again, it's 7 students per 1,000 students with disabilities. And that's very, very alarming. And so that goes back to what you're saying. I believe that a lot of times people in the school system are not taking the opportunity to fully look at their students' portfolio to see what challenges they're having. So as you indicated, their needs are not being met. People don't understand how this particular student, especially with the disability, functions or responds. And so the default is maybe to go towards punitive measures.
Right. Well, and I would say, from the work that we do, a lot of the approaches that are taken, again, are very focused on compliance. And in my mind, that's the wrong goal. In my mind, that's absolutely the wrong goal. Yes, I mean, kids need to understand that there are boundaries and they need to get along with others, and there are things that are acceptable and things that are not. But compliance for compliance sake sometimes leads to a lot of difficulty for kids and educators. But so often, we find that's a big part of the focus. And if you focus on compliance, you're not really kind of putting the thought into, like, why is this child having a difficult time? Why are they having a difficult time now? Are they, is it a matter of skill? Are what we ask, or are what we asking that child, is it developmentally appropriate? How does their disability factor in? There's a lot of things that you should be curious about, but very often there's that kind of really heavy focus on getting kids to comply. And many of our programs, I mean, that are, you mentioned kind of the negative and punitive consequences, but there's a whole lot of research out there that we've gotten into that looks at even the other side of that, trying to kind of change behavior through rewards and tokens and all of these things that actually show not to be very effective with kids with disabilities and kids that have a trauma history. But those are very much on the menu of things that are done very frequently, with kids that are having a hard time. And sometimes it's a matter of changing expectations, changing supports, figuring out why a kid is really having difficulty with something. Sometimes it's a matter of skill or other things that need to be focused on.
Yeah, I that is consistent with the information that has come back to me through my research and through my interviews.
Yeah.
One of the things that was a reoccurring thing was restorative practices, and one of my series parts, I dig deep into that, opportunities to sort of right the ship and move away from over policing schools and criminalizing typical adolescent behavior.
Right.
And so if your viewers have an opportunity to read I believe, part 2 of the series, it will go into that, as well as part 4.
Yeah, we're really into the alternatives of this punitive and approach. So can you give us a nutshell without kind of going into the whole story? But I mean, what did you find? Because we've certainly done some work and research around restorative practices. I've got friends and colleagues. Joe Brummer's one that wrote a fantastic book about trauma-informed restorative approaches. And certainly can see the benefit of some of these approaches. But I've also seen restorative approaches not used the way they're intended, which then ends up not giving you the results. But what did you find in your kind of exploration of kind of restorative practices and how they had a place in helping?
With regard to that, there seems to be more so a focus on community and policy shifts, sort of to center the students' well-being, keeping youth in the classroom, and keeping them on track academically. There were different advocacy groups that I interviewed during the process of my 10-month fellowship that had these wonderful ideas that they wanted to implement, but they felt like they needed the support not only from the school administration, but also to have it sort of codified in law.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the challenges that they were encountering, was there were some policy put in place, but there was no financial support, which is needed to sort of implement these things. One of the items that kept coming up, because I do touch upon school resource officers, And I think we can't ignore the fact that they are embedded in schools, that a lot of times teachers and faculty and administration are calling on them to address behavioral issues, and they're sort of caught in the middle.
Mhm.
And so I do look at in-depth school resource officers. Uh, some of the people that I've interviewed, public defenders, um, juvenile and youth advocates, disability rights advocates, do point their fingers at school resource officers. However, there is this over reliance on them that makes it that contributes to these touch points for these kids with law enforcement that puts them into the school to prison pipeline.
Right.
And it's there is a strong desire to sort of walk that back, but not too far back, because there is an acknowledgement that they're needed in the community. And so one of the things that it's sort of off focus, and I think I took my fellowship committee aback when I did that, but part 3 of my story looks at school resource officers, because I don't want to bash, I want to give both sides of the story.
Right. I remember reading that story, and you actually you did a really good job of that. You had interviewed someone that was, and I don't remember the interview exactly,
His
but
name's Mike Rudinsky.
yeah, okay,
Mhm.
yep.
Yes. And so, and I feel like I'm talking in code for everyone else, but you're familiar with the work. So in part 3 of Homeroom to Handcuffs, I talked to and I dive deep into a school resource officer by the name of Mike Rudinsky. And he initially had been working in Prince George's County in a program called Spotlight on Schools. And Spotlight on Schools is a program that's no longer in the state of Maryland, but what it did was it brought in probation officers into the school system, paired them up with school resource officers. And this was mainly for students who were already in the pipeline, to keep them on track and keep them moving towards graduation. And the interesting thing about Mike Rudinsky was he was and not to offend anyone, a street cop. He was a police officer in the community. And this is before they had training for school resource officers. So he's coming in the school, and he's got, and I'm borrowing the words from one of the people that worked with him, one of his colleagues. He has the mentality of a street cop, but he's in a school setting. And so he develops this unlikely bond with a probation officer, with 2 of them. One of them is Joan Cox, and the other is Mary Blair. And working together, he begins to change how he works with students in the school.
Right.
So instead of being punitive, instead of arresting first, he's got this new approach, because these women have been working with him. And I don't want to give away too much of the story, and I won't use their quotes anymore, so that it'll be new to whoever reads it. It'll be interesting to whoever reads it. But he's now, when there's students that are having fights, instead of arresting them, he is pulling them to the side, having them take a breather, taking a walk,
Right.
Forging relationships with these students, working on solving problems instead of
Right.
just the outcome of punishment and consequences for their actions.
Right. Right.
And he winds up working at the state level and using what he has learned and experienced and how he's transformed, working with both Joan and Mary, he's influenced policy and procedures for school resource officers in
Mm-hmm.
the state. And
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
I mean, it's absolutely. I mean, I think that's it's a very positive. And I remember reading the story, and I mean, truth be told, in my world, I would prefer to see fewer police in school. I prefer to see more social workers and counselors and therapists in schools. Often we're lacking, those resources, the other thing is that, and again, I mean, recognizing that there are people that are out there doing work, like this example that you bring up, that I think are doing work that's meaningful and that's helpful and supportive. But you can't even take a baseline to think. I mean, people often think, well, police in schools, everybody's going to feel safer. Not everybody feels safer seeing a police officer. There are people with past experience, past trauma, that just the presence of police can make schools seem less safe to them. So, I mean, it is certainly something that I think is complicated. In a perfect world, though, I would like to see, more of the supports that I think are often lacking.
Right. And that's what's come out. One of the requests, and we were talking about that before, just a little while ago. One of the requests was, and some of it is unfunded, to invest in staff training for managing non-criminal behavior.
Right. Right. Well, one of the things I'd love to see is I've been doing a lot of work, and we've done work with the Alliance. We even partnered with CPI, Crisis Prevention Institute, in helping them develop training. And it's not crisis training; it's upstream training. It's helping people understand behavior differently. We do a lot of work around helping people to understand human behavior through the lens of the brain and the nervous system, versus these ideas that we have about people making bad choices, and and that shift can be so transformative. I would love to see, more of our positions of the people that are supporting working with kids in this capacity understand behavior through a different lens, because I think it makes all the difference in the world in supporting kids differently.
Yes. And we talked, you talked briefly about mental health support in the school. And that was one of the reoccurring requests to have less cops, more counselors.
Right.
There was even legislation.
Yeah, there's been a federal bill that's been introduced. That has unfortunately not passed in my recollection. But yeah. Well, let me ask you one more question on this chart. I know we've actually we probably want to move on to some of the other charts here. But you had this data here, the 21-22 and the 22-23, and you mentioned the decrease. And I guess I have two questions. One, I'm sure you looked at, well, you said you looked at the longer data set as well. Had there been a progressive, decrease over the last, decade that preceded this, or, was it fairly stable for a while? I mean, I know that if I look at like restraint seclusion data, it was really interesting. You can find correlations between zero tolerance policies and then kind of the move away from zero tolerance. What did you see in the preceding, years prior to what this chart is showing?
Well, we have to take into account COVID.
Yep.
So of course, during COVID, the COVID years, the numbers were significantly down.
Right. But not for good reason,
Right. Because kids were not in school.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. They were working they were virtual.
Yep.
Learning remotely. But prior to COVID, the numbers were up. Now, what's interesting is I didn't cover 2023, 2024. I had filed my story before that data dropped. But I did take a look at it before coming on today's show. And what I found surprisingly was that school-based arrest numbers are up overall 5%.
Oh, okay.
Which is unfortunate. There's also an increase in the number of Black students arrested, roughly 5%. So,
Yeah.
but what is even more alarming is the number of students with disabilities from 2022 to 2023 to 2023 to 2024 is up 16%.
Mm-hmm.
So the last year I covered it, 359 students with disabilities were arrested. The subsequent year, it's 418.
Wow. Wow.
And so, while my work is done in terms of research for this particular project, it's going to be interesting watching over the next couple of years how those numbers trend.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I have a tremendous amount of concern based on changes that are happening at the national level. With the Department of Education, with the Office of Civil Rights, with the Department of Justice, that there is a potential that we're going to see increasing and more impact on students with disabilities and Black and brown students. And I'm really concerned that already there's been changes at the Office of Civil Rights, for instance, which might have been a agency that would look into issues of concern of disproportionality and some of the discipline practices. So I've got a lot of concern based on and even looking at funding at the federal level and how these could impact students with disabilities. A lot of concern over where we could be heading, and I hope that concern is wrong, but it seems like we're losing some support for things that may be critical in helping to really address these issues.
Yeah, that's interesting that you note that.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll let you continue moving on here, and I know you've got some other slides. These conversations always go really quickly. You're like, wow, this just happened.
Yes, I can't believe that. Yes. And now I'm just warming up. I'm literally cold because it's cold here, and it just adds to everything. So what I kind of wanted to cover was trends related to Black students in Maryland's schools in comparison to other racial demographics. What you see here is a chart that looks at the school-based arrest rates by race for 2022-2023. And when you look at it, you see St. Mary's County and sadly, once again, Wacomico County has the highest arrest rate disparity for Black students in the state.
Mm.
And so what I see in terms of trends, a severe overrepresentation in arrests for Black students. Black students comprise 33% of Maryland's student population, but account for 57% of all school-based arrests in 2022-2023. As I indicated before, for every 1,000 Black students, 3 were arrested compared to the statewide rate of 2 per 1,000 for all students across all demographics. There are disproportionate referrals just for that disturbing school charge. Black children, Black students are 5.5 times more likely than white children to be referred to Department of Juvenile Services for disturbing school activities.
Mm.
Once again, hotspots: Wacomico County, St. Mary's County, Washington County, Harford County, trying not to say the T.
Yeah, I always say it. Don't feel bad.
Yes. And, I mentioned it before, the numbers are down, which is great. We've got to applaud that. I'm not just looking to highlight what's bad. If there is improvement, I think we as journalists, we need to acknowledge it. Even though there was improvement from the year before, 28% drop in school-based arrests, the racial disproportionality persisted and even increased in several of the counties.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the common themes, some of the common situations are, especially with Black students, in addition to being arrested more, they're usually arrested more for vague, subjective offenses like disturbing the schools.
Mm-hmm.
Charges. One of the things that one of the common themes that I encountered in talking to legal and advocacy groups was that the disparities seem to be tied to systemic and implicit biases in school discipline. And so what they're saying is that once again, ordinary, typical adolescent behavior, especially among Black students, is being criminalized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an important point. In fact, I was, as you were leading into that, that was kind of the question I wanted to ask you, which is the why. And that seems to be kind of part of the underlying why. But, why St. Mary's County? Why Wicomico County? What's different there? What might a district that finds themselves at the top here, what might they want to focus on? And any thoughts on that in terms of, what a district might do that is finding themselves at the top of these arrest rates and disproportionality?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm not prepared to answer that question completely today. And for those that don't know, I started this fellowship in 2023 and wrapped it up in 2024. And I can't even remember the number of interviews I've done. It's somewhere close to 30. And so in some situations, school districts were not willing to talk to me.
Mm.
And I acknowledge that in my story, that I've reached out to a particular district in every possible way. I tried to give the districts that I was reporting on an opportunity to address or correct what I was seeing in the data, or to provide an alternative to what someone had shared with me in an interview. So for some of these counties on the top of the list, I don't have an answer for you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw, and I feel like we talked about this at one point, but I know Project Baltimore had covered some of this at one point, looking at arrest rates, and they were looking at Wicomico. Actually, Calvert as well was another one that was high. There were several that were high, and that was based on, I think, the MSD, the Maryland State Department of Education data that had been out. And it was interesting. Actually, the superintendent from our district was featured in the story, and there were some things that he said that I was kind of concerned about. Kind of talking about tough love and almost sounding like the high rate of arrest was a positive thing, and that concerned me. But it does seem like when there's pressure at a district that sometimes we see this almost touted like, well, we're taking a really tough stance here. And I mean, of course, there's roots there that go back to zero tolerance, and of course, there was a lot of research around that as well. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
While you were talking, I sort of started thinking about Anne Arundel County.
Hmm.
Anne Arundel County is probably a good example of a county that was at the top in terms of school-based arrests, had very high numbers, and the numbers have come down significantly.
Mm.
And they did, they were willing to speak to me, but they've also had, I think what has contributed to their climate of change is their movement. They're not limiting themselves to punitive measures. They're looking at other measures to address behavioral issues with students.
Mhm.
And they also have a new superintendent of schools. So I
Mhm.
think there's a combination of things happening in Anne Arundel County, to include them working with the advocacy groups to sort of address these problems. I don't think working in a vacuum is going to resolve the issues,
Mm.
right? But when you take um, an approach to work with the groups that support the people that are aggrieved in this situation, I think it goes a long way. But I'm wearing my journalist hat today, and and I should be as objective as possible and just sort of focus on the data. But I hear what you're saying,
Sure, sure.
and I think if you want to see an example of the tide turning, and an improvement in how disciplinary measures, behavioral issues are being handled, Anne Arundel County for the years, because I
Mhm.
haven't looked at the 2023, 2024 data, but the difference between 2021 and 2022 and 2022 and 2023 tell a big story for
Mm.
Anne Arundel County.
Yeah, sure. I mean, leadership matters. I mean, I know from my own, situation. I mean, all the alliance started from personal experience. It started after my son was restrained and secluded, and then I found the data that showed that, oh, gee, Calvert County has a problem. Ultimately ended up working with the superintendent, members of the board of education, and not to say it was an easy process, but the Board of Education encouraged the superintendent to form a committee to look at this issue, and encouraged the superintendent to invite me to be part of that committee. And they did. And actually, several other parents, were involved as well. And, that committee formed and began looking at this issue. And ultimately, and again, I'm leaving pieces out here, but ultimately, through the leadership, and the board's, support as well, we were actually able to influence a change in local policy. So we were able to influence a change in policy at the level of the Calvert County Board of Education to sunset the use of seclusion, reduce the use of restraint. And then they brought in training to help them do that. And they went from being at the top of the list to being very much towards the bottom of the list. And I think, when there is an issue and, the community and school leaders and others come together, there's potential to solve things. But, I've also worked with people and families from across the country, where there's real concerns about, things like this, where districts are not so open to change. It's more of a circle the wagons and, kind of you know, defend the practices, and unfortunately in those cases, change doesn't happen. Sometimes in the case of some of the work we've done around restraint seclusion, sometimes it's taken that Department of Justice investigation or an Office of Civil Rights investigation or something else to motivate change, and that may come with a change of leadership as well. I mean, and how those cases may work from being a journalist, that a big investigation may lead to some sudden retirements and new team members. But yeah, that leadership role is really critical, I think, in changing culture.
Yes. And it's interesting. When I started my fellowship, I was working on the 2021, 2022 data. And I believe Calvert County, a lot of the Southern Maryland
Mhm.
counties were pretty high up. But as I was getting close to my deadline, I knew that the subsequent data was going to be dropped within a matter of days, and I asked for an extension. But this chart that you see right here, this infographic had been created with the prior year data in mind, and it's very different. Calvert County was on this and was up high.
Yeah.
There has been sort of like a paradigm shift in some of the counties from just within a matter of a year or two that show their improvement or increase in school-based arrests. So I'm going to move on to the next chart, and this is looking at school-based arrests for students with disabilities. And I think this is really, really important. You know, as I shared before, students with disabilities make up 13% of Maryland student enrollment in 2022-2023. But they had a school arrest rate. The actual arrest rate, yes, the school arrest rate was actually, I think by the time I did this data, the arrest rate was 7 students per every 1,000. So I'm going to have to update this chart. But what was interesting is Wacomico County, and I feel like I'm beating up on Wacomico.
Well, you know, I actually I lived in Wacomico for a period of time. I went to Salisbury University and University of Maryland Eastern Shore and lived over there, and actually still have you know, friends. One of my best friends for forever is a teacher in Wacomico County. So you'll be sure that I'll be sharing a lot of this with my.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I'm just following the data.
Yeah.
But what is of the students, and I think I shared this, of the students just with the disturbing school referrals, they're 3.3 times more likely than a non-disabled student to be referred for disturbing schools. They are arrested for disability-related behavior. I think I shared earlier, especially with regards to the young lady in Anne Arundel County that was 11 years old. They are behaviors that have been indicated in the IEP or 504 plan. But for some reason, that the arrests and referrals don't look into their IEP or 504 plan to see that those behaviors and how to handle them are addressed in that documentation. One of the recurring comments that I've had from legal advocates is that the children with disabilities are criminalized for conduct that should be, and you pretty much alluded to this, should be handled through their educational supports and not through law enforcement.
Right.
We talked about the hot spots before, Eastern Shore counties, and here's an example. 42% of students arrested in Wacomico. And pronounce it for me.
I always said Wacomico, but
Wacomico.
Yeah, but I don't know that I'm the expert. So I mean, I lived there for a number of years, but I was not native to there. So
in Greenville.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I live in Calvert now, but when we moved
And
here when I was young,
that's Calvert.
Yeah, there were people that called it Calvert. So you know, I am not the pronunciation king.
Okay. Yes, but one of the things that we don't talk about enough is the impact on the students and impact on the families. One of the frustrating things for me was that I was not able to talk to any students, but we were prepared for that in our fellowship because the goal was not to re-traumatize any of the students that had been arrested. So we were encouraged to try to talk to parents if possible, to talk to lawyers and other supports for students, whether they were students of color or whether they had a disability.
Well, you're bringing up a great point. I mean, it is absolutely something that can be traumatic, not only for the child involved. Any punitive exclusionary discipline can be traumatic on a child, but a encounter with law enforcement, being arrested. I mean, these things can be really traumatic. And the interesting thing is that if you really kind of dive into this, what you find is that an increase in trauma leads to often not a decrease in behavior, but it leads to it leads to actually changes that occur in the brain. Those
Yeah.
changes that occur in the brain lead to hypervigilance, lead to stress behavior, lead to an increased likelihood, not a decreased likelihood of some of the behaviors that may be related to all of this. So it's not that these things are effective. They're not. They actually can lead to more harm, not less. And the harm on the families as well. I mean, it's extremely traumatic for a family to go through these things. Yeah.
And I have other data that I think is important, but it's data that people can get from the story. I think what is really important to address is some of the testimonies that I got from the public defenders. One public defender had indicated that their client had been a student that had been bullied in school numerous times, and that the parents went to the administration and asked over and over again for them to address the issue of bullying with the student and with the parents of the student that was bullying their child. And in this particular case, nothing was done. The bully continued to bother the student, and the student snapped, retaliated, and attacked or fought the student. Let me use the word fought.
Right.
I think that is better. So I apologize because I think attack is pretty strong. But the student was now in the school to prison pipeline because of that fight in response to constantly being bullied. And so there are other examples, like that. And there's situations where students are not meeting their milestones academically, but they're being promoted so that they can be with their peers.
Right.
However, they're finding themselves frustrated in class because they can't keep up with the work.
Right. This gets to what we talked about earlier. Child not having their needs met, a child that's more likely to become frustrated, more likely to become dysregulated, more likely to have behavior. So these systemic things that are happening are part of a big feed into what becomes the school to prison pipeline.
Yes. And in one of the part series, and I apologize because I can't pull it up right now without going past. Oh, there it is. Okay, there's the part. There they are. The part 2 of From Homeroom to Handcuffs looks at resource officers, poor academic instruction, and other factors that academia, advocacy groups attribute to why students are being arrested disproportionately in school.
I want to ask you a question. We've kind of reached the end of our time here, and we've got the articles. They've all been linked in the chat here as well. So I want to encourage people to go and check out the full series of articles, because you really do cover a tremendous amount of ground in this, and have a
too much.
There's a lot, but it's
the fellowship committee kept trying to pull me back and hone in, but I just felt like there's just so many elements to this story that I've got to at least cover 4 of them.
Right. I want to ask you a question, and again, not specific to the story per se, but just based on all of your experience in doing this. Any thought from all of the research you did and all the people that you talked to, if a family were experiencing concerns related to this, or had a child that might be, kind of experiencing things related to the, kind of arrest or interactions. Do you have any recommendations of resources? I mean, you mentioned earlier Disability Law Center or Disability Rights Maryland, but are there other resources that you might recommend for a family?
Definitely. So if you are a parent or a family experiencing an issue of this nature, definitely, and you have a child with a disability, definitely reach out to Disability Rights Maryland. The attorney for the young lady in Anne Arundel County was Logan Ewing. I believe Logan is a female, is still there with Disability Rights Maryland. If not, there are others. They were extremely helpful. I talked to multiple people there, informing my story. Levi Bradford, who I mentioned earlier, is an education attorney with the Public Justice Center, which I believe is in Baltimore. He can speak on racial and disability disparities and disturbing school referrals and the school to prison pipeline. He has a wealth of information. He knows a lot of people. He's probably a great resource for someone. I'm trying to think. There are, man, I'm just looking at the list of people that I talked to.
Mm-hmm,
There
mm-hmm.
are public defenders that are also education attorneys. I would look to see who is in the county for the school district that you're within. There are, if you are a family of color, specifically Black, I would reach out to your local NAACP. Most of the NAACPs have an education committee. For St. Mary's, if someone is from St. Mary's, Janice Walthour, who happens to have been a former administrator in St. Mary County Schools. So
Gotcha.
what I'm finding is there are people who have, just like you, have been inspired by, personal situations that have pushed them towards advocacy. There is another organization that is similar in nature. It is, but it's more race-based. It's the Anti-Racist Education Alliance. Their acronyms is AREA. The leader for that is Matthew Vaughn Smith. He was great to talk to. He happens to be an administrator in Montgomery County Public Schools, but he lives in Howard County and he does advocacy across the board. He has a son that is neurodivergent. He speaks in my story about his concern for his son, for his behavior, being potentially handcuffed and arrested.
Sure.
And being concerned about his son being reprimanded for the same things that his white peers only get warnings for.
Right.
And so he is big against restraint and arresting elementary school kids and carting them off.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Also, Maryland State Education Association. I spoke with Cheryl Boast, who was the president at the time.
Yep.
You familiar with her?
Yeah, I'm familiar. Yep.
Okay. And just, I could go on, and I know
Sure, sure.
time is running out, but someone needs um if someone needs a reference, feel free to you can reach out to me, Guy, and let me know, and I
Sure,
can
sure, sure. Yeah, yeah,
list.
yes. So people are always welcome to reach out to us, and we're always happy to connect as well. And the other thing I wanted to mention, just kind of as you were going through this, of course, we're talking here in this story. You were looking at Maryland, but again, these are things that we see happening across the country, and a lot of the resources that you mentioned. I just want to point out to people that whether it be the protection and advocacy organizations like Disability Rights Maryland, every state has at least one of those. The NAACP, reaching out to your local resources, certainly recommend that you consider doing. And, this is something that absolutely we see happening kind of across the country here in the U.S. We've got to kind of reach our wrap up point here. And I just want to ask you if you have any final thoughts you want to share with us as we wrap up today. I really appreciate this conversation and you sharing this research that you did, and want to encourage people to check out the full series. As you mentioned, there's a lot there, but
Yeah.
it's really valuable. And I mean, as we were talking today, some of it was coming back to me, some of the particular articles that you wrote. And I mean, it really is a valuable series, and I appreciate that. But
I
any other
appreciate
final
it.
thoughts you want to leave us with?
Yes. You asked a couple of questions, and I sort of want to address those in terms of what it means and why it's happening, and as far as the disproportionality. And I know for Black students, staff often perceive Black student behaviors as more threatening. So that is one reason why it's happening. And then schools often misinterpret disability-related behaviors as intentional misconduct. So those two things I think we need to take away. You did talk about as systemic. There's structural issues. There's over-reliance on law enforcement. I think that's important. But what is needed to change, and this is what I took away from my research, was there's a push to remove the disturbing school charges
Right.
from the law. Several attempts to that, and they failed. There's a push for investing in staff training for managing non-criminal behavior. I know I brought that up. And then there's a push for improved or more access to mental health professionals and disability supports. We talked about that.
Yep.
But the community and policy shift is, center with a focus on student well-being and keeping kids in the classroom instead of punishing them and pushing them out of the classroom. So one of the biggest things, and I wouldn't have been able to do this story without it, is ongoing data monitoring, and for parents and the community to be engaged and flag the oversight organizations when these issues happen. I think that is very important. So
Yeah,
those
absolutely.
those are the takeaways.
Yeah, Maryland, of course, puts out data on things like restraint and seclusion, and this year I had to remind them several times about their obligation to get that data out to the public.
Right. And they vary it. So let me tell you, with Maryland, I know you want to wrap up with Maryland, with this particular, I'm on their listserv.
Yeah.
So every time they drop a report, they send a press release out. But for the report on student arrest data, this one, it was quiet, no fanfare, and I even found anomalies in the data. And if I had written the story just based on their first report, it would have painted a very different picture that would not have been favorable for Maryland. So I flagged the anomalies.
Yeah.
They pulled the report now, and they released the report a few weeks later. And it really changed the whole narrative.
Right. I had a similar experience at one point when a report came out, and I'm not going to remember the specifics, but what I think I remember is it was Montgomery County, and they were showing something like 0 restraints or 0, I think it was 0 seclusions, and I contacted the county to find out, like, what are you doing right here? Because the report says you have zero. Well, it turns out they didn't really have zero seclusions. There was an issue with the reporting, but it really takes some persistence, I think, and asking questions if things don't seem right. So we do need people, parents, families, journalists, and I appreciate you and all the work you did on this series and your ongoing work as well. Um, I think really meaningful. I know you've got a last link that you were leaving us with here, but I'm going to go ahead and remove the slide deck, and I just want to thank you again. I'm going to ask you to stick around for a second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else. And hope that you've enjoyed this. If you joined us today, I encourage you when you watch these, share them. It's really important. These are things that can really be helpful and meaningful, and encourage you to share the podcast. And look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. So we will wrap up. Tamara, thank you so much for being here. And if you hold on for 1 second, I'm just going to thank you one more time behind the curtain here.
Thank you.
And we will see folks again next time. Thanks so much.